All right.
Hello there.
Professor Yaron Harel, Dean of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, Professor Revital Rafael Vivante, Head of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, speakers of the conference, colleagues and students, friends and guests, I have a tremendous pleasure to open the Bar-Ilan Conference on Russian-Israeli Literature, which is being held on the platform of the Program of Jewish-Russian Studies at the Department of Literature of the Jewish People at the Faculty of Jewish Studies in Bar-Ilan University. This time, our conference is a concluding event of the International Research Group that has worked in Bar-Ilan University during current academic year with the support of the rector of the university. I invite Professor Yaron Harel, Dean of the Faculty of Jewish Studies in Bar-Ilan University, to greet the participants of the symposium. Professor Harel.
Yes, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to welcome the opening of this important conference, Russian-Israeli Literature History. Anyone who has read my autobiography knows that I have roots in Russian culture, since the family of my late father fled Stalin's rule in the 1930s and immigrated to Eretz Israel. My father and his brothers kept their Russian accent even after decades in Israel. Meir Shalev, in his book, Russian novel, Roman Russi, laments what in his eyes was the good old land of Israel. This country, whether true or false, was essentially Russian. After all, most of the songs we used to call the land of Israel songs, Shirei Eretz Israel, were brought from Russia during the first and second period of Aliyah. Let's ask ourselves, what is considered Russian-Israeli literature? Is it referring to Israeli writers born in Russia? Perhaps those who write their novels in Russian? For example, Moshe Smilansky, the Mukhtar of Rehovot, the first Aliyah man, was born in the Kiev district that was part of the Russian Empire in 1874. At the age of 16, he immigrated to Eretz Israel, and his letters from Palestine impressed their leaders so much that Yaakov Mazeh, the chief rabbi of Moscow, predicted that this boy will be a famous writer in Israel. But here in Israel, Smilansky is defined as a Hebrew writer who writes a lot about Arab life under the pen name Hawaja Musa. Is his writing in Russian-Israeli literature? Writers who immigrated from Russia in the 70s and have lived among us for 50 years, are their works Russian-Israeli literature? I suppose we are going to hear today some of your answers. The initiative of Professor Roman Katzman, the entrepreneur behind the conference, joins the momentum of success of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, led by Professor Revital Rafael Vivante. Since she is forced to leave this position because her husband, Professor Shmuel Rafael Vivante, was elected to replace me as the Dean of the faculty, this is a great opportunity to thank her for 4 unforgettable years. I wish us all a fruitful and enjoyable conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harel. And now I invite Professor Revital Rafael Vivante, Head of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, to greet the participants of the symposium. The microphone. The mic. No, can't hear, no. Can't hear you.
Vital, maybe try to sign out and come back again. Just very quickly.
תתנתקי ותתחברי מחדש. No. All right, I use this minute to say my thanks, to send my thanks to the people who are responsible for this great event. I'd like to thank my colleagues, the participants of the group with whom I had the pleasure to work in the course of this year, including those who don't take part in today's event. And many thanks go to the previous rector, Professor Miriam Faust, and the current rector of Bar-Ilan University, Professor Amnon Albeck, for supporting our research group. And many thanks to Professor Rafael Vivante for providing the financial and technical support, and most importantly, the moral support. Thanks to the secretaries of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, Ms. Inbal Dahan, Ms. Rachel Chen, and Dr. Anat Aderet. Thanks to graphic designer, Mr. Raphael Blumenberg, the Zoom support team, Mr. Oron Copenhagen and Mr. Menachem Schechter. And finally, thanks to all the speakers and guests of the symposium. And I really expect great intellectual event today. And now, Revital, can we hear you? רויטל, את שומעת אותנו? שומעת אותי? לא. לא שומעים. No, please don't share for now your materials. All right, Rita, what would you like to do? You want to send me your greeting? All right, yeah, please do it. In a minute, I'll have the greeting from Professor Rafael Vivante, and I suppose I should read it. Vital, perhaps you'd like to greet the end of the session or the beginning of the next session? Okay, 1 more minute. Okay, I suggest that we proceed. And just could you please mute all your microphones for the beginning? And Erital, I still don't have your greetings, so we'll start in the meanwhile, all right? And if you want, you could join us later during the symposium, okay? All right, I'll be in touch with Revital. Okay, in a moment, the first session will begin, but first, let me introduce its moderator, Professor Claudia Smola, who has been a member of our group, but doesn't make a presentation today. Professor Claudia Smola is chair of Slavic literatures at Technische Universität Dresden. She's an author of numerous researches in Russian and Russian Jewish literatures, aesthetics, poetics, literary theory, and culture. She's an editor and co-editor of many collections of papers. Among her recent publications, a book in German, I'll try it in German, Wiedererfindung der Tradition russisch-jüdische Literatur der Gegenwart. That is a reinventing tradition, contemporary Russian Jewish literature. And the publication of Russian translation of this book, «Изобретая традицию. Современная русско-еврейская литература», is expected any day now. Claudia, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Roman, for inviting me to this important conference and for their organizing and leading this huge publication project, which I think is going to be a very decisive step in the investigation of Russian Jewish literature and Russian Israeli literature and culture. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to briefly provide some organizational information. We have decided to schedule the questions and discussion part after all 3 papers. So please remember or note your questions or comments for this concluding part of the panel. Thus, we ask to turn off the microphones until the end of all 3 papers of the panel. To ask your question, please click on the button Raise the Hand in the lower part of your screen. I'm not sure, but I have this in the lower part of my screen. Or you're also invited to write down your questions and comments in the chat space. And last but not least, we would be really very grateful to all speakers for not exceeding the paper time of 20 minutes because we have a very dense program today. And I think, Roma, we have a 5-minute break after the panel. Okay, and now I would like to introduce our first participant, Roman Katzman. Is a professor in the Department of Literature and the Jewish People at Bar-Ilan University. He is the author of books and articles on literary theory, on Hebrew and Russian literatures, as well as on Russian Jewish intellectual heritage. In recent years, much attention in his research has been paid to Russian language Israeli literature, which is the subject of this conference. And he has published 3 books on this subject. One in English, and that is Nostalgia for a Foreign Land in the Academic Studies Press, and 2 in Russian, elusive reality, and the sublime lightness of creation. So the stage is yours, dear Roman.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much. And let's begin indeed. All right. Russian-Israeli literature as a whole historical phenomenon, in my opinion, contradicts the neo-Marxist paradigm of identity politics, which includes, for example, the theories of minor and marginal literatures, hybrid and transnational literatures, and thus it reflects the necessity of searching for a new paradigm. Discussion of Russian-Israeli literature has to begin with one qualification and one definition. First, the qualification. By Israeli literature, I here mean a literature created in the land of Israel, both after the proclamation of the State of Israel in 1948 and prior to it, which in our case basically includes the period of the Third Aliyah, 1918, 1923, and the succeeding quarter century. Second, the definition. Russian-Israeli literature is a corpus of works in Russian, either created in the land of Israel and the state of Israel, one, or determined in an obvious way by an Israeli historical cultural context, two, or originating as a result of the participation of the authors in Russian-Israeli literary processes and in the life of the emergent community produced by them, three. The correspondence of one or more of these three criteria defines one or another work as Russian-Israeli. In my remarks, I will focus on clarifying the third criterion in this definition of the principle of an emergent community. Israeli-Russian language literature in over the century of its existence traversed a difficult path. Starting in the years of the great changes in the 1920s, it decreased during the years of pre-state construction and the Second World War. It trickled through the 50s and 60s and finally spilled out as a broad flood during the brief but powerful Aliyah of the 70s, following the Six-Day War and renewal of the persecution of descendants after the thaw and the unfolding battle for the rights of Soviet Jews to national self-determination and repatriation. It was precisely in this period and in this ideological and political context that the self-awareness of Russian-Israeli literature was formed as one of the courses of the battle for the rights and a place for the reawakening of Russian Jewish identity in the geopolitical and socio-political reality of the age of new wars, both cold and hot. It seemed that the very genotype of this literature consisted in elements of a policy of identity. It took on the mantle of a minority, in the terminology of Gilles Deleuze, from Russian Jewish literature in relation to Russian literature, and at the same time started to construct its marginality, this passion, including a sense of superiority, in relation to Israeli Hebrew literature, which was by then already sufficiently formed. In the marginality of Russian language literature in Israel was political and, so to speak, natural from the 20s to the 60s, then the marginality of the 70s and 80s was already also cultural, partly as a result of the fact that this was in many ways an auto-marginalization rooted in a deep self-opposition to Israeli culture and literature. This is all the more significant since this way of Aliyah was suffused with the pathos of Zionism and a return to Jewish roots. In other words, its inherent policy of identity became the source of its minorization and marginalization, and thus of its self-definition. The failure of the auto-marginalization project and the inability to attribute a politically and aesthetically meaningful character to its minority, including incidentally the feeling of superiority as well, led to another identity crisis of Russian-Israeli literature. Toward the end of the 80s, the supply of ideology of heroic victimry identity was formalized and exhausted, and it was not finding any new sources of inspiration. Having not too many readers and attracting feeble interest on the parts of critics and philologists, it increasingly withdrew into itself and into its complex of dual Russian-Israeli exclusion. Everything changed with the beginning of the Great Aliyah of the 90s. The fall of the Soviet Union and the mass exodus of Jews from it, the opening of the borders, the end of the Cold War, globalization, the dynamization and even chaotization of the social order, postmodern relativism, the weakening of national narratives, and finally the development of personal computers and the internet, all this together put an end both to the 200-year-long Russian Jewish literary minority and to the 100-year-long Russian-Israeli marginality. The literature of the 90s felt itself more and more comfortably and non-confrontationally as a part simultaneously of international Russian literature and Israeli Jewish nationally major literature. It was thus, so to speak, double major. The era of the minor Russian Jewish literature has ended. On the other hand, Russian Israeli literature was gradually curtailing the project of auto-marginalization in the context of Israeli culture, becoming an autonomous part of the chaotic process that was independent from the system of social hierarchies and relations of the cultural center and the periphery. This process of deminorization and demarginalization was completed by the beginning of the 2000s. Abandoning the pose of unacknowledged and proud victimhood, Russian Israeli literature returned, or for the first time entered into Russia and into the whole of post-Soviet space, in the publishing houses, festivals, book fairs, journals, and media outlets. Part of it turned considerable efforts into understanding and internalizing Israeli culture, while another part, on the contrary, concentrated on its place in Russian and international culture and literature. But in both instances, it stopped being essentially identical, although questions of cultural affiliation often continued to agitate it. These tendencies intensified even more in the period of the so-called Putin Aliyah of the 2000s and especially in 2010s, continuing a narrow but stable stream to this day, where any group and identity policy can be placed in doubt by virtue of both atomization and globalization of literary processes. To sum up this brief historical survey, I would say that Russian Israeli literature in any of its stages cannot be defined as zonal or regional or transnational literature, or as part of greater regional literary systems, since all these concepts have their foundations in the discourse of identity that proved to be insufficient, and the aesthetic programs based on it proved to be failed. In spite of its title, this literature cannot constitute a part of such multicultural and multilingual regional systems as Israeli or Mediterranean, and on the other hand, cannot be simply included in such regional and indefinable systems as migrant, diasporic, or Russian foreign literature, русская зарубежная литература. In order to comprehend the current condition of what arbitrary and without total justification can be called the community of Russian Israeli literature, it is essential to rethink the very concept of literary community. So deep are the changes in social practices are undergoing both generally and within the world of art. I'd like to start with the definition of an emergent community, which it seems to me best corresponds to the nature of the Russian-Israeli literary process. Okay, so in the most general sense, a community that is not reducible to the sum of the factors that define it is called emergent. Like physical emergent systems, it consists of an indefinitely large number of various elements and multidirectional processes, and it is defined by a large number of disparate factors. In other words, it had the nature of deterministic chaos, and as such, it causes unpredictable forms of self-organized behavior in the forms of dissipative structures. Okay. An emergent community is not a group or collective, and thus terms of group identity do not apply to it. It is not governed by group dynamics. Attempts to form in it or in regard to it a policy of identity are doomed to fail. It can be shown that any real human community is emergent, non-group, non-identity generating. In brackets, I'd say my notion of non-identity in a sense is an opposite to this notion by Theodor Adorno, since his is aimed at deconstruction of the subjectivity and mine and deconstruction of collectivistic, that is socialistic ideology. Neither community nor identity is an a priori category. Therefore, any definition dividing people by formal attributes, language, geography, nationality, can be nothing more than a hypothesis. Only research based on experiential knowledge can prove it. The same applies to a category such as minority. In order not to be only a mathematical category, but to become a category of a community, it must be proven empirically. A minority is not a priori a community. And in general, isolating a certain statistical group does not make it a community. The Russian language and the state of Israel define the boundary conditions of the existence of a system, but do not predict the appearance of concrete forms of behavior within the system. The main thing that can and should be said about this system is that the meaning of the Russian-Israeli sign-generating and culture-generating process in it surpasses the simple combination of Russian and Israeli processes. This surplus meaning is, in our case, the basic transformation, in Igor Smirnov's terms, of the literary system. It creates emergent solidarity and is precisely what makes up the symbolic and cultural capital that Russian-Israeli literature is accumulating. In spite of the fact that this literature is not a community, it possesses a common cumulative capital that is not reducible to any of its component communities and does not belong to them separately. While the Russian and Israeli meanings constitute the reality of existence of this literature, its extra, emergent meaning arises from understanding, experiencing, overcoming, and appropriating this reality. Thus, in the strict sense of the word, only that literature will be Russian-Israeli that produces this surplus meaning, that is, that cognates and overcomes Russian-Israeli reality. Such a literature, while being Israeli, is not only Israeli, but opposes being appropriated by an Israeli process, and on the contrary, itself strives to overcome it. While being Russian, it does not allow Russian literature and the Russian language to appropriate it, but on the contrary, fights with them. The bold example of these dynamics is the journal Article. It not only is to the same extent Russian, Israeli, and Jewish journal, but also strives to create a new surplus form of literary existence. It's precisely this surplus, emergent meaning, that serves as a crystallization point of true communities' fellowships inside the non-community of Russian-Israeli literature. Thus, journals appear such as, for example, Mirror, Зеркало, Colon, Двоеточие, and Solar Plexus, Солнечное сплетение. For each of them, the reason for its establishing was one or another form of literary experimentation, one or another understanding of avant-garde. To the extent that this growth of avant-gardist capital in these communities arises from the opposition of Russian and Israeli conditions and conventions, they, communities, can be defined as part of Russian-Israeli literature. This dynamic is at the same time dialectical, that is regular in its basic structure, and emergent, that is unpredictable and chaotic in its concrete behavioral manifestation. And nonetheless, in spite of all the chaotic nature of this system, one can say of it with complete precision that it gives birth within itself to Russian-Israeli literary communities when, and only when, the work of separate processes attains the above-mentioned synthesis of Russian-Israeli conditions and the superfluous, that is creative negation via experiencing, cognizing, and appropriating. It is impossible to ignore this emergent character precisely because it is what is responsible for the augmentation of meaning that serves as a foundation for a given community to arise and be defined precisely as a true community fellowship and not as a statistical group. Nonetheless, the solution exists, and it, like the program, consists in the concept itself, or rather more precisely within the concept that is connected to it, and is no less contradictory of a dissipative structure. The attention of the scholar approaching the study of Russian Israeli literature should be concentrated not on the mutual, essentially illusory transference of features between the group and the phenomena that constitute it, but on organized structures that dynamically alternate between appearance and disappearance in an a priori chaotic environment, so that it is impossible to derive the causes of the appearances of structures and their features from this chaotic environment, and that they must necessarily be considered self-organized outside any dependence on the intentions and way of acting of concrete organizers or organizations. And I'm concluding, then the features of an individually taken phenomenon will correlate not with the features of one group or another, but with the features of a temporarily arising form of ordered behavior, social, cultural, aesthetic, the center or part of which it thereby becomes. This is an individual, not group behavior, although this is a behavior of a group. It is neither regional nor national literature, although it is created mostly in a certain region and by a certain national group. Thus, the history of Russian Israeli literature would consist of a multiplicity of the individual behavior forms of small emergent communities, constituting the the larger emergent community that is not a sum or unity of small ones, but dissipative structure of the greater scale that fractally reflects the structures of its components. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roman, for your conceptual beginning of this conference. And now we go to the second paper of this panel. And I would like to introduce our speaker, Leonid Katzman, is professor and chair of the Department Theology of Judaism, Bible and Jewish Studies at the Russian State University of Humanities in Moscow. He authored several books, among others, Осип Мандельштам, Мускус иудейства, Кровавый навет и русская мысль, историко-теологические исследования дела Бейлеса, 2002, and 2006, Русская весна Владимира Жаботинского, Атрибуция, библиография, автобиография, the recent book, 2019, and others. He has published numerous articles on Russian and Russian Jewish literature, history of anti-Semitism, and Russian Jewish philosophy. So, Leonid, I would like to invite you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I am glad that the first stage of our project is now near its finish, and then let's discuss our plans to publish some of our results. But now I want to discuss a very specific problem closely connected with Roma's lecture. What does it mean to be Russian Israeli author from the beginning? What is minority, community that accepts this literature? First circle is Russian literature and Russian Jewish literature. If you want to be Russian Jewish writer, then you must be as first type of minority. The second type, very rare but interesting, is really Palestinian writing. Let's call this process so. I mean sketches from Palestine, the Russian Jewish magazine, for example, about colonies, about Zionism, and so on. And so we have two circles of minorities. Then, if you want to become a writer as Avram Vyssotsky, for example, if you want to live in Palestine and to publish in Gorky's Letopets, for example, and in Riga's publishing houses, then you became not Israeli literature because it exists at the time, but you are a person who sent his text to Russia. This is a problem if it is possible to discuss such texts as literature process. Then another point is what we do with such writers who come to Palestine, then left it, and so on. Once I sent to Roma as a joke one text which was called an introduction to Russian history of literature of Ural. Original literature, of course, but its authors wrote us that we include here such writers who had lived in Ural, including such strange authors as Mamin Sibiryak, member of Ural literature, but with his pseudonym connected with Siberia. And then they included in their list of authors, they included there such writers, poets, and so on, even classics of Russian literature, who spent some times, it's not the same, in Ural. For example, Pushkin, Kuchelbecker, Dal, Leo Tolstoy, and so on. So this situation can be parallel to our situation when, for example, Leonid Gershovich came to Israel and then Germany, and who writes now from Germany, who publishes now in Russia. So if we include this methodological principle in our theory of Russian Israeli literature, then at one or maybe two stages of its history, we can say that it's a Russian regional literature. Russian Jewish regional literature. It's not a joke, because you know that if you, for example, live in Ukraine or any other further Soviet republic, and if you came to Moscow, you now become a Russian writer. If you want to be, for example, if you live in Israel, you are a Russian Israeli author with, for example, from Ukrainian, example, origin. But if you want to come to Israel to spend some years there and then return to Russia, then this period, this may be level of Russian Israeli, maybe Russian Israeli Russian literature. This is connected with such authors as, for example, Yulia Kim and so on. They are not from Jewish origin, of course. So we may say that we have some kind of a, for example, original or in Russian областническая литература. Then, what can we do with the history of such literature? Maybe the problem is that we must cut these periods on the special levels, because if somebody came to Palestine in 20s or 30s and who had written to, for example, 70s, one level, and all contexts are Palestinian state and then Israeli literature. If somebody lived in Russia, in Soviet, for example, Russia, and published under pseudonyms in any languages, including Hebrew, for example, and Yiddish and Russian in Israel, but who lived and died in the Soviet Union, then it's another level. And then such writers who came to Palestine or Israel, Israel maybe nearer for us, then this is the history of Russian Israeli literature. It seems to me that such methodological problem must be solved during our study, our collective study, because it seems to me that we can't discuss even 100-year history of any literature from one point of view. I don't know what is true, for example, United States, but for Germany with GDR and so on, you see that we have the same problems. It is more general problem than the problem of our specific interests. Then let's look at the
Alenia, microphone.
He's switched off, but lives with his own way. Then let's look now at internet era, this situation. It's not so simple, because you know that some Russian organizers of the literary process decided to organize some kind of Russian literature except Russia. No such projects. For example, led by Dmitry Kuzmin, for example. Russian poetry, not in Russia, but in all countries around Russia, not only around Russia, but without any connections. It's Russian literature, because it's Putin's literature. Okay. Then, what we have? I heard from Verbelsky that when he wanted to close his magazine, he looked through statistics and found out that maybe 160,000 readers read his magazine. So it's not a literature for one point of the old map. And now we can return to the discussion of Yiddish and Hebrew literature at the beginning of the 20th century, when Zionists, from the point of Yiddish view, decided to put their
Microphone. Leonia.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's compare this situation with the discussion between Yiddish and Hebrew, Zionist and not Zionist literatures at the beginning or maybe first decades of the 20th century. Then we found that Yiddish writer could say to you that I write my poetry, for example, in Minsk, illustrated it in Australia, and published my book in New York. And so we have some kind of world literature. And wanted to put us in the very, very small part of the board of Asia and Africa. That's all. Now we have no such contradiction. And now all such literatures can become world literatures in this point of view. So Russian Jewish literature, Russian literature, and Russian Israeli literature can become equal from such point of view. This is maybe the fourth stage of the history of such literature. I wanted to point out that I tried to maybe some main borders on this process. For example, Walensky and Berman, their collection text, then publicistics and very short novels in Russian Zionist magazines, then some authors from Palestine who wrote it in Palestine and published in Russian, mostly émigré publishing houses. Another line, Soviet literature about Palestine, wrote by writers who came or visited Palestine or lived there. Then we have Soviet anti-Semitic literature about Palestine, even wrote by the participants of the Israeli wars, such Kolesnikov, very, very interesting figure. And then we have maybe legendary, very, very emotional, really perestroika literature about Israel. And then we have immigration or repatriation of writers to Palestine and the organization there, magazines, literary groups, literary series, and so on. And now, really, as Roma said, we came to the equal literary environment. But it seems to me that maybe it will be useful to stop before internet situation and study it not in the traditional terms of history of literature. It's new situation and a very, very complete position, or even from our point of view as researchers. And we have very many new situations which can be chosen by authors of such literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyonya, for your paper. And I introduce our last speaker, and that is Denis Sobolive. Is professor, literary scholar, and writer. He is the author of 9 books, has published numerous poems, short stories, and essays, as well as more than 60 academic articles on literature and culture, which have been published in 10 countries. His novel, Jerusalem, was shortlisted for the Russian Booker Prize, and another novel, Mr. Carmel Legends, 14 Tales of Love and Time, has been nominated for the National Bestseller Book Prize. His academic interests include cultural theory, philosophical approaches to literature, phenomenology, metaphor, and allegory, Victorian and modernist poetry, religious literature, and the literatures of the Jewish diaspora and interculturality. So I would like to give you the word, Denis.
Yep. Thank you very much, Claudia. As promised, I'll try to be brief, especially as a considerable part of what I was going to say was said by Roman before, so it will be relatively easy for me to be brief. And I would like to apologize for the horrible quality of the picture. This is the best I can get from here. It's more or less 5,000 miles from Israel and in countryside. So it's the best picture I can get. The topic of the paper is the transition between 2 different types of poetry written in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And these are I would like to pinpoint several differences, and it seems to me there is no a clear-cut boundary between the two types, but there is an essential difference, and the difference relates to what Roman said about the process of demarginalization, which is never defined as a project, but it's something that happened throughout the poetry of the Russian-Israeli poetry of the 1990s. Back to an earlier stage, basically, once again, without entering sweeping generalization, the poetry of 1970s and partly 1980s was more or less a post-colonial project, whereas identity-based, identity-bound, and post-colonial by and large, which meant resistance to the Russian identity, which was experienced as imposed on the Jewish cultural identity, the pathos and the of self-liberation and liberation, and once again, what was supposed to be the Zionist ethos, probably it wasn't. As a result, what actually happened, in addition to this very substantial ideological basis, this poetry found itself in double confrontation towards the Russian literature on the one hand, and the, at least partly, mainstream Israeli literature on the other hand, because the Israeli literature of the 1970s and 1980s wasn't post-colonial. So there was double isolation, but this ideological, mainly ideological character, as far as I understand, was much more felt in prose, whereas poetry foreshadowed the shift that happened in the 1990s, the shift that I defined in the title of my paper as a transition from the ideological to ontological. Ontological not in the sense of what the world as it is, as we know it, actually is, but ontological in the sense of the ontology of the human existence, of the human being, what it is to be a human being in the world around us. Once again, in the poetry of the 1970s, this future ontological turn was foreshadowed through different channels. One of them was quite simple-minded, poking fun of Israeli militarism somehow, as it was experienced, at least partly, war-oriented poetics, which was not mainstream in the Israeli poetry of that time, but somehow was supposed to be mainstream by the immigrants of the 1970s. The other one was some double immigration. The immigrants of 1970s found themselves in a position to the dominant Russian-Israeli discourses of the 1970s, and then returned back in their imagination to the pre-immigration Russian Soviet experiences, mostly not in their ideological form, but in the experiential, human forms. And probably the third strategy of this ideological crisis, more prominent in the poetry of the 1980s, was the aesthetic turn, somehow transferring the accent from the identity and ideology to the aesthetic to aesthetics. Once again, the shift still was perceptible, partly because of the social and existential reasons. The repatriation / emigration of the 1970s, at least officially, was much welcomed. The immigration of 1990s was, how to say this, to say the least, less than warmly welcomed both by the Israeli media and the Israeli society, and the economic and human and existential conditions were incomparable. I mean, it is less known probably to the Israeli reading audiences, much more known to the insiders of the immigration of the 1990s. It was really living with hand to mouth for year after year after year after year, in the atmosphere of complete uncertainty, and the society, once again, which was less than welcoming. Once again, as a result, what is, as it happens in cultural history, which is something that is probably traumatic experience for human beings, can be a huge source of inspiration for literary culture, and this is what happened. Poetry was broadening, and it's necessary to understand that once again, in contrast to the early stages, to the Russian-Israeli poetry of the 1920s or 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, in the 90s, there is a huge corpus of an extremely good poetry. It's not one writer, 2 dozens of hundreds of poets were writing, probably thousands amateur poets were writing, and among them there were dozens of first-class, exceptionally good poets writing simultaneously. Once again, a part of them were writing about their own identity, and the same continue on the problematics mentioned above, but mostly it was not about this. It was about the existential experience, to a considerable extent, in its most naked, most painful, poignant parts and aspects from the basic bodily experience. It seems a bit nonsensical speaking about poetry without quoting poetry, but I have to admit, it's first not enough time for this at least partly convincing number of quotes, and secondly, I'm just incapable of translating all this into English, somehow retaining the stylistic different tones, different styles, and all the rest. So I'll try to speak without quoting, even though it's a problem, speaking about poetry without quoting poetry. So the first layer was about the basic bodily experience, being embodied, feeling body within the world, once again, body vulnerable within this kind of experience. Second, this poetry was in cross-cultural sense, much less confrontational. It wasn't, once again, by and large, confrontational towards Russia. And even though those people who spoke publicly about the Zionist commitment simultaneously wrote very touching and deep poetry as regards the Russian experience and the Russian culture and their different ties to to Russia, which was, once again, as it was not identity-based and not post-colonial, they didn't have this obligation of confronting, in no sense, not embracing or celebrating their ties to Russia, neither confronting and denouncing these ties. In this sense, is definitely Russian poetry. At the same time, as it was non-confrontational toward the Israeli culture, it is also Israeli poetry in every important sense, as it was related to almost every aspect of being in Israel, of living in Israel, feeling Israel, experiencing Israel and Israeli society and Israeli experience. And what is most important, as the horizon broadened, this poetry felt even internal moral obligation to touch upon every important subject of the human existence in the world, Israeli and the world existential experience. Once again, from being in time, from being in the world, being in the body, having emotions, very different, mixed, contradictory emotions, both in the human sense and in cultural sense and the political sense, to the highest, but highest not in the term of the hierarchy, highest in the term of the imaginary hierarchy subjects to the religious problematics, which is very palpable in this Russian-Israeli poetry of the 1990s, to the basic cultural questions of reading, experiencing the beautiful, experiencing the human relation toward the beautiful, the human relation between an individual and the community, an individual and the human milieu around the individual. And what is most important, and this is somehow comes to the mind as a sharp contrast between what was actually written and what was said in different interviews. When these poets, and once again, a huge amount of them, were interviewed, somehow they felt that they have to, how to say this, to follow the main line of the public discourse within the Russian-speaking society in Israel and the Russian media, which is mostly political and ideological. So they spoke about identity, repatriation, integration within the Israeli society, the same thematic repertoire that was very prominent, very palpable in the poetry of 1970s and 1980s. But this was not what, this was by any means, this was not what was actually written as poetic text. There were political texts and were ideological texts, but most of them were not. They were laying bare all different kinds of the human experience within the world, of the basic existential experience in its various forms, once again, from the emotional sphere, basic emotion, intersubjective emotional sphere, to the most basic question of human existence, the meaning of human existence, alienation, loneliness, faith in God, the loss of the faith. And with this poetry is incomparably much richer than what usually came out within the public discussions and especially media interviews. and this is something that is that should be studied as a huge textual corpus and not as a historical phenomenon as it is expressed once again in interviews or public discourse, or even self-consciousness as it was textualized through different public forms. Basically, that's it. This is the double contrast between the two periods and between the public expression and the actual literary and textual corpus, which is extremely impressive in different generations. From the generation that came to Israel in the 60s, 70s, to the younger people who began to write in Russian in their being whatever, 15 or 16 or 14, there is a huge variety and huge richness and diversity. Thank you.
So thank you so much for all three papers, and Roman, Leonid, and Denis, and also for considering the time limits. I think it was really a very fine example for others. So I think the papers will raise a lot of comments and questions, and I would like to open the discussion maybe once again. To ask your question, please click the button, raise the hand. You can speak, or you can write down your comments or questions in the space, in the chat space as well. So I would like to open the discussion. Well, we have one question from Zlata. Zlata, please.
I have two questions, one to Professor Katzman and one to Professor Katzis. The first, my question, can you explain, Roman, what is the essence of Russian-Israeli literature from the third point that you described? Because I didn't understand. And my second question is to Professor Katzis, because...
Let me answer,
yes.
please, first to this question. The first point was the process, yeah? The literary process which is taking place in Israel. And my point was that the literary process is a very complex phenomenon here. Every place literary process is not a simple phenomenon, but Russian-Israeli literature is especially complicated literary process. And then any book or any literary world event or literary fact that is part of this literary process of becoming of Russian-Israeli literature can be seen as part of this Russian-Israeli literature. But in order to make this more precise, I add the concept of emergent community. So process is a very general concept. And you can analyze it in different directions. And one of the directions is pointing at the communities or the net of the communities that exist here in Israel or around Russian-Israeli literature. And then, and you know, all this issue of the community is not my very favorite thing, and Claudia knows it very well. I'm not a man of community research, but Claudia is. But if I'm trying to observe this network of Russian-Israeli literary communities, I'm arrive at the conclusion that they have very special character. This is emergent communities, appearing, disappearing, and what is important, the communities that are defined by that the meaning of literature they produce is the surplus of the two factors, a Russian factor or Israeli factor. This is the process of overwhelming both of them. And this gives to all this Russian-Israeli literary process the chaotic, the nature of deterministic chaos, yeah? The nature of self-organizing synergetic system. And it gives us new instruments to approach the history of Russian-Israeli literary process. That was the point.
You were speaking about literary unit, journals, literary community, theaters, in general or conference?
Yeah, all of them, yes, all of them, of course, yeah.
Thank you. And my second question was to Professor Leonid Katzis. You said a lot about Palestine and not Israel. I agree that there is state of Israel, or still it's now only Palestine. What's your spiritual ground point for describing Russian Israeli literature? Spiritual point, not only place point.
It's a very, very strange question, because I discussed the problem of the history of the 100 years. So one stage of the history of Russian Palestine pictures in very, very early books and collections. And just after the 30s, we must discuss the problems of Shuv and then Israel. So I try to point out that it's very important to look to the history of the Russian Israeli literature, and then it's continuing during the 20th century. That's all, without any spiritual problems.
Thank you, but it wasn't clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zlata. We have one more request to speak by Yelena Babikov, please. We can't hear you, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, I turned my microphone on. Hello, my name is Yelena Babikov. I'm speaking from Japan, so I will try to speak in a small voice because it's a late time here. Actually, I have a question maybe for all of three presenters, and it's really like small question on terminology. In 2013, like about 8 years ago, I was invited to a conference in Tokyo University about world literature. So there was many presentations on many literatures, and I was invited to present about exactly the Russian Israeli literature. And it wasn't my specialization, but because I was from Israel and somehow related to literature, so they invited me. And when I tried to look for like previous research, I found some. It was research by Anna Ronald, I think her name is Anna, and it was research by Mr. Krutikov and Mr. Weisskopf, and Israel Shamir also wrote. It wasn't exactly research, but some kind of discussion. And I found that there is no one term that, like this, all these people writing more or less about the same phenomenon use different terminology. For example, it was Russian language Israeli literature, or Russian Israeli literature, or Israeli Russian literature, or it was literature of Russian Israel, and Russian literature in Israel. There was so many terms, and I myself used another term. I wrote about Russophone literature of Israel, which was, of course, the translation of русскоязычная литература Israeli. So now, can we speak about Russian Israeli literature as a term that already established, because it's 8 years passed since then, and even though I didn't follow the subject, but it will be very interesting to hear your opinion on this matter. Sorry for the long question.
I don't know who would like to begin.
Yeah. So maybe from Professor Katz.
Denis wants to.
Denis, yeah, Mr. Sobolive, yes.
Basically, as far as I know, it was much more a question of self-definition of the scholars, or not only writers themselves, and somehow these terms differ from the applicability of these terms, differ from writer to writer. There are some writers, and I also was puzzled even much earlier by this terminological disagreement. There are some writers who felt that they're articulating Israeli experience, or by contrast, Israeli experience as it should be, as Roman said, but never happened, from this position of superiority. Once again, imaginary superiority. There were different types of, once again, identity-based discourse, whereas identity was understood in different terms, as Israeli identity, speaking Russian Russophone, Israeli identity, or Russian identity as it is voiced in Israel. And some of the writers, poets, prose writers and poets and literary critics felt that they're just in exile, like the first emigration, in cultural isolation, in exile. They're writing for Russia, for a Russian audience. They're Jewish Russian writers living in Israel. In this sense, probably all these terms are accurate and correct, but the degree of their applicability varies from writer to writer, from self-consciousness to self-consciousness. But what is most important, the difference applies mainly to the problem of self-consciousness as it is expressed in different texts, and much less to the texts themselves. And as regards the text, there is a corpus, there is a huge corpus of very different, diverse, variable, changing text written within the same existential situation. And in this sense, it seems to me any term is a compromise, but we need one term because this is one corpus. Once again, one corpus, diverse and heterogeneous, but it is still one. So probably we can call it a kettle or whatever, but this should be the term. And any term you mentioned fits and misfits basically in the same way, as far as I understand. And it seems to me Russian Israeli literature is probably the less misfitting as regards the entire corpus. That's it.
Thank you, Denis, for answering for all of, at least for also for me. I absolutely agree. And indeed, Yelena, there are several schools here, but since there is the questions, more the questions of the theory of history that should be considered here before we define the literature. So we can't a priori to define it this or another way. The research has to come before definitions. And for now, we absolutely well with this general definition, Russian, Israeli, Israeli-Russian. There is no ideological contents in this title. And there are several schools which are based, as Denis said, on the identity theories and different ideologies. And this is not, at least not my way to approach literature. And I prefer first to study the corpus and the history, and then give definitions. And I reveal that definitions always are much more complicated than all these ready-made titles, yes? Lunia?
Words, maybe. It seems to me that we must maybe give some definitions. For example, according to our project, Russian Israeli or Israeli Russian literature maybe is a category, then some types of such literatures from Israel, about Israel, getting through Israel, maybe term, and then definitions according to the self-definitions of some groups like Mediterranean Note and something else. And that's all. It can be pointed out at the beginning of the chapter, and then let's only be very careful to our position at each level of this structure of category, term, and then definition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you.
We have one more question from Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this wonderful start to the symposium. There's such fine papers, and I especially appreciate the way that Professors Katzman and Katzis have laid out a kind of general paradigm for thinking about what makes Russian Israeli literature distinctive. My question is really addressed to Professor Sobolive. I was very struck by what you've called the ontological turn in the poetry of this period, and very much share your perception of the period as a time of tremendous poetic flourishing. I write on Russian poetry of the period up to the very present, not just in the context of Israel, but as wherever the poets are living, including, of course, in Russia. And what strikes me is that the thing that you've defined, which has long struck me as true, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone else articulate it. So I have this great moment of happiness that the thing that had struck me as so important, you've actually given a better name to it. But I wonder if it's in fact a distinctive feature of the poets who emigrated to Israel. It seems to me that it is broadly found in poets writing in Russia in this sort of moment where the Soviet Union collapses and where the old paradigms fall away, and poets can begin to turn to the external world, wherever that is, even if they've remained in Russia, and experience it in completely different ways. So that the transformation in the poetry has to do with the broader historical moment, maybe, and not with the experience of Aliyah or encounter with Israel. I wonder if you think that that's true.
Yeah, furthermore, I would say this is a kind, as you said, a moment of happiness for me too, because you said something that I just felt I have to leave outside the paper, that there is a part of the broader moment within the Russian literature, but somehow it was sharpened and articulated. I guess we can speak about the entire Russian literature of the 90s as the literature of immigration, because the entire Russian society actually emigrated from the one, broadly speaking, imperial Russia / Soviet society to different national cultures, and it underwent a huge human, economic, social, and cultural crisis. So Russia entering the 1990s and Russia leaving the 1990s, well, the Putin Russia, whatever it's called, that two different countries, and the entire society, basically everybody underwent this experience of emigration. And in this sense, the Israeli-Russian literature, it's definitely, as I was trying to say, it's very much a part of the Israeli literature in general, but it's also very much a part of the Russian literature and the general experience the Russian literature underwent, because it was an emigration experience. But still, it seems to me as the physical emigration, not only cultural and social immigration from one world to another world, to one society to another society, but physically losing everything, moving to a different culture, learning different language, trying to understand different culture, embracing, once again, simultaneously embracing and confronting it in different existential ways. Once again, as it happened in Russia, sharpened this experience, and therefore some of the most impressive, prominent, deep, revealing expressions of these ontological terms are found not in the Russian or Russian-Ukrainian literature, but specifically in Russian-Israeli literature. This experience was much more sharp, much more intensive, and correspondingly its poetic outcome and poetic reflection upon it and poetic contextualization of it was both much more articulate and much more in very many cases much more impressive poetically. And this, it seems to me that the fact that this entire corpus, as Elena said before, was only a few years ago very much understudied and was not appreciated enough, is something that it is important to make up for, both from the Israeli point of view and from the Russian point of view, and definitely from this Russian-Israeli, Israeli-Russian point of view, and Russian-Israeli, Israeli-Russian context.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I have a small question for you, Roman. Maybe you can say a couple of words about the Putin Aliyah. You have mentioned this term, and as I'm engaged with the recent Russian-Israeli literature, I just wanted to ask you if it is an established term, and maybe even what is the specificity of its literature, or maybe not. Thank you.
This is a rather an ironic term, okay. I think. Yeah, no, it's not a serious term. Yeah, it's but this is a aliyah of the recent period. Yeah, after in the period of Putin in Russia, it has nothing to do, I think, particularly with Putin. Yeah. But this is a different kind of communities, of different kind of connections between two countries, a different kind of dynamics, of course. It's much more mobile, much more global. But I think that the end of our symposium today will be the presentation of Elena Promyshlansky exactly on this period. So let's wait to the end of the day and see.
It seemed to me to be political, to have a political implication, Putin, Lenin's culture and literature. It could be very interesting, but thank you very much. We'll wait for
No, I didn't mean any special political in this. And I don't believe that there is something political in this term. This is not exactly term, but kind of humoristic observation of the situation. On the other hand, perhaps can be done a kind of political analysis of this new, but it will be sociological, I believe, more sociological analysis. And as you already know, I don't believe this sociological approach can assist us very much in literary historiographical research.
Thank you, Roman. Well, we still have, I think, 10 or 15 minutes for our discussion. Would someone like...
Larissa Fialkova would like to ask.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, Larissa, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm not sure that Putin's aliyah is an ironic term. I'm sure that it has no connection to literary process. With this, we have no difference in our understanding term, but in general, I think it has very clear political implications, political and sociological implications. From the one hand, these are people who were rather well established in Russia, mostly in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they go living in the countries where they could live if Putin had not made his politics much more strict, much more depressing for intellectuals and people with global orientations. So I think that these are people who would never immigrate if Putin had not changed his politics. I'm not sure it's an ironic term. Sorry.
Yes, I think it was a very important comment. I think you're right. That this has a certain resemblance to the late Soviet time, and this aliyah term of the late Soviet time. So maybe it could be an interesting and important subject for discussion, or in our book, in our volume about Russian-Israeli literature of the recent times. Yes, maybe you would like to comment on this, Roman, or maybe not.
No, I trust Larissa. She knows very well the subject. She exactly deals with these issues from sociological and literary sociological folkloric point of view. Yes, and of course, she's right. But I'm not sure that this criterion can be applied only to this period. Maybe in any period we can find a couple of social or cultural factors that influence people and influence Jews to move. This was the situation in 2000s, in 19th and 17th, in any point of these 100 years of history. So that's right. The question is only if when we observe the history, we want to comprehend the historical process, what would be our point of view? What would be our approach? And the theory of literary history is very complicated matter. So there are several schools, of course, very well known, but I'm not a big fan of the sociological approach. So I believe that the literature should be historically comprehended from other points of view. But that's okay. It's not to say that the sociology or political processes don't have any sense, of course. All right.
Well, we still
1 minute.
Leonid wants to ask something.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. May I say on this subject? You know that when we discuss such matters as literary history, we must show that we have specific problems, plots, and poetics. I can't say that we have any epoch of poetics. So it's not a subject for our literary history. But on the other side, the problem is that international sanctions brought us many problems in academic mobility. So very many citizens of contemporary, I don't know Russia, but Moscow and St. Petersburg get Israeli darkons in order to have such mobility. It doesn't mean that this problem is in any cases connected with the politics and so on. You may come to Moscow bookstores and so on and find that we have no ideological problems specific to, for example, methodology of historical studies, ethics of literature, avant-garde to traditional, and so on. So it's very, very interesting problem, and maybe let's return to it in a special meeting, and maybe it will be interesting to discuss this problem from our internal point of view and your external point of view, from the point of view of the state who accepted such aliyah or immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Yes, I agree that we can't have a straightforward answer to this question of political aliyah or some other.
It's not a problem, but very, very specific. So let's think about it and discuss it.
Today evening.
And, let's invite Larissa to make specific lecture on it from her point of view. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Roman, I think we can conclude with this, and we meet in 5 or 7, I think in 10 minutes even. We have 10 minutes for a break.
In 6:15, we'll start the next session.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question of organization. Will there be a free entrance or not? Because people may go here and out, and there must be some.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
Because I had problems with entering. I had to ask for help. I was a bit late.
I don't know. Anyone who wants to enter can enter or leave or enter again at any moment. So 6:15 Israel, Jerusalem time. Yeah. Okay. In 5 minutes, we're all here again for the next session. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia, so much for this moderating.
And thank you once more for all the really inspiring papers. So thank you very much.
Thank you.